Center, Sacramento. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today because typically you see Dr. Kravitz up here, our center director. However, he's on sabbatical this term, and so I get to do the speaker intros for the winter term. Professor Till von Wachter is the Associate Dean for Research at UCLA's Social Science Division, as well as a professor of economics at the University of California, Los Angeles. He serves as faculty director of the California Policy Lab and director of the California Census Research Data Center. Professor von Wachter's research examines how labor market conditions and institutions affect the well-being of workers and their families. And his current research projects focus on job and earnings mobility of young workers over their careers, as well as several projects on homelessness and understanding the relationship between employment and housing stability. Professor von Wachter has been an expert witness in numerous testimonies before U.S. congressional committees, and has provided expert assistance to the U.S. Department of Labor, the Canadian Labor Ministry, the United Nations, and the IMF. Please join me in welcoming Professor Till von Wachter, who will be speaking today on employment and earnings among LA County's residents experiencing homelessness.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, and thank you all for coming. I'm Till von Wachter. I'm a professor of economics at UCLA, and the work I'm presenting is joined with Nifar Arish, who used to be an analyst at the California Policy Lab, now does a PhD at Harvard, and Geoff Schnorr, who is an embedded researcher at the Employment Development Department and a graduate student at UC Davis. And I'm going to start out with a couple of disclaimers. The first one is the report on which this presentation is based is still embargoed, and it's coming out in a few weeks. So if you're interested in receiving a copy of the report, either drop me a business card on the way out or send an email to me or to the UC Center, and we'll get you a copy. Right? The second disclaimer really is I'm a labor economist by training, so I thought a lot about labor markets and employment. Here we're going to be talking about the employment of the homeless, and there may be some questions that are very good that you have about the homeless that I won't be able to answer and that I'll take down. And that this is the second time I presented, so your questions at the end will help us think some of this through. So I look forward to that. And then I should say I wasn't prepared for that big of an audience, so this talk should be accessible to everyone, and I'll try to make this sort of as general audience as I can. Here and there, I'm a professor. There'll be some statistics, then feel free to ask clarifying questions. So with that as a backdrop, let me just give you a couple of things that are useful to understand the project. This project is a project for which we at the California Policy Lab at UCLA have partnered with the Los Angeles Homelessness Service Authority, LAHSA, and the Los Angeles County Homeless Initiative and the California Employment Development Department to jointly do this research. And the way the California Policy Lab operates is that it seeks long-lasting partnerships with the state and local policymakers to address some of the state's most urgent problems, and homelessness is one of those problems. And so when we suggested to LAHSA that we could analyze the employment patterns of the people they serve, they were very excited. But we also seek projects that are academically interested. That's what we do. We're academic researchers. And it turns out, actually, that there isn't a lot of work on employment of the homeless. So that's why we're here. I should give you a bit more of the policy backdrop. In California, in LA, and I think in California generally, there's a current debate about how acute the homeless are. So many in the public, I think, are of the impression that a lot of the homeless are, mentally ill, or have severe health conditions, may be drug dependent, right? And that's often informed by the fact that the folks that you typically see on the street, right, are in a very difficult situation. And so much of the programming that LAHSA and other homeless service authorities do is, focused on these very acute homeless. Right? And the reason for that is that that is partly the humane thing to do, to aid those most in need, and partly that's how counties seek to prevent further costs down the line, to take those most needy off the streets. Right? But there's also a sense by which we might be looking under the lamppost, meaning that those who are on the street in encampments and who are most acute are those that we immediately can reach out to and find. And there's an increasing question whether there's another group of homeless that may have become homeless more recently, right, may not be as acute, right, and may be more functional and may be able to transition back into society with less costly interventions. And here's the hope that we could intervene early to prevent some of the real damage to the individuals that homelessness can make. Right? And I think it's not hard to agree on that having been employed recently and having employment capacity isn't an important feature of being sort of a functioning, stable, and self-sustaining member of society. And so that's why we'll be looking at employment. So what really we do in a nutshell is that we take administrative data on employment, and I'll talk a bit more about that, and merge it to data on services received by the homeless in LA County. And we're going to be using this data answering a series of questions, but the advantage here is that given that the data has been collected by the state and the county, it is quite good data. So our employment data doesn't suffer from recall or measurement error, and we have very long time series and can observe people really many years before they may have become homeless and sometimes years after. And I'll talk about the data a little bit more in a moment. And we're going to be answering 4 questions. Right? The first question is, well, let's take stock. Are there homeless who have been employed in the past, right? How many are there, and how far ago is that homelessness, that employment, excuse me? And then we're going to talk about who are the people who are most likely to work, right? And that is, of course, an interesting question if we're thinking who we could reach out to best support, return to employment. And then I'm going to talk about how does employment change around receiving homelessness services. And that's an important question because we're really trying to answer the basic question here of, is the homelessness crisis or the housing crisis closely related to an employment crisis, or are these really 2 separate things? Right? That's what's going to be our third big question. And then at the end, we're going to talk about earnings. Once the homeless work, right, how much are their earnings? And of course, an important question whether the employment that these individuals have, allows them to actually sustain themselves. Now, just a little bit more background. There are actually very few studies on employment and homelessness, and there's really just one I'm aware of by Dennis Cohane, an eminent homelessness researchers and co-authors, using data from New York City. Right? And casual observation suggests that LA is very different from New York City, and this really matters in this case because they had annual employment data for individuals entering shelters. In New York City, there's a right to shelter, and so shelter entry is often very closely related to homelessness. Our data will be at the quarterly frequency, so better suited to actually look at employment dynamics around homelessness, and we will have individuals who received a much broader range of services, not just entry into sort of a temporary shelter. Right? And we also have information on the type of industries these individuals work in. And but I think that the big difference is that in LA, street homelessness and living on the street is much more common than in New York City. So the individuals who actually end up receiving services may have been homeless for quite some time, right? So it's very important to understand homelessness and employment in the LA context, right? And then compare it to, say, the New York City context. So with that as a backdrop, let's start, diving a bit into the detail, right? I'm a researcher, so really I'm all about how the sausage is made, and I'm going to try to keep detail as a minimum as possible and go to the results, but I think this is helpful to understand what we do. So the Los Angeles Homeless Service Authority, and I'm just going to call it LASA, right? Our partners at LASA sent us the data from the so-called HMIS, which is the Homeless Management Information System. And that is the system in which every homeless service authority has to enter the data on programs funded by federal funds. So if there's a private Catholic charity giving homelessness service, we don't have that information, but the majority of services receives federal funding. And so we see individuals who come and stay in an overnight shelter, who have been reached out to in the street, who receive permanent supportive housing, meaning they enter a permanent housing subject, or who receive, say, a temporary housing vouchers. Right? So it's a very rich data set containing service records for homeless in LA for 9 years, from 2010 to 2018. And that data was sent to the Employment Development Department, and EDD, as I'll call it, collects quarterly earnings for all employees in California. And they do that because based on the quarterly earnings in the last year, they determine eligibility for unemployment insurance. And the earnings records that they collect, are highly sensitive. They stay at EDD, and we have an employee, Geoff, who accesses the data at EDD. And it's an invaluable resource to understand employment patterns. And it doesn't capture, the same way the HMIS doesn't capture all employment services, the EDD doesn't capture all employment relationships, so it wouldn't capture relationships that are not employee relationships. So gig economy is not in there, so the Uber driver would not be in that data, or domestic workers or the black market. So I'm not saying, and that it's very important, that these non-standard forms of employment may not be very relevant, particularly for poor individuals or the homeless. We just have no way of measuring them in this data. We did check the employment rates and the administrative data with self-reported employment rates for what it's worth in the HMIS, and they're very similar. And we have access to 24 years of quarterly earnings records at EDD. And so we take these two data sources and merge them together, right? And the end product is that for each person who showed up in the HMIS, who obtained a service, we know their quarterly employment before and after, if they had any quarterly employment. Right? And this merge is done at the individual level. So now, let me talk a little bit about the sample here. We limit our sample to working-age adults from 18 to 70. Now, anybody who has thought about labor markets knows that that's a very large group, right? And we're going to be talking about sort of subsets of that group. And we could only look at individuals. Not only did they have to receive a service, right? And they had to be an employee. They also had to have a valid Social Security number with which we could merge them, right? So we don't see the Social Security numbers at the California Policy Lab. That's done in a secure location at EDD. But to do that, you have to have a valid Social Security number. And about 70% of HMIS clients have a valid Social Security number, right? And those become our study sample. And then an immediate question for anybody thinking about statistics is, what about the third of individuals who don't have a Social Security number? Are they similar? And the answer is yes. That's why we're here, right? Looking at these 70% captures, a group of individuals that on all observable characteristics is very similar to the entire group of individuals who receive homeless services. And that is very important. And so these individuals, ages 18 to 70, who have a Social Security number and receive homelessness services, are our study samples, and some of them had employment at some point, and some of them didn't. And now the next thing we do is to start using that data to look at our first research question. Right? So I said we had 4 questions. We want to know what's the incidence of employment, just as a baseline. How many of the homeless worked, and how long is that employment ago, right? And then we're going to move to who is employed and so on. So that's the first question. How much do people entering the HMIS work. And so here you see a graph by which we plot the fractions of our study sample of those who received the homelessness service who worked over certain ranges of time. Right? And so the one takeaway is that about 75% of our sample worked at some point in the past. Now, that's a pretty large fraction. So some of these may have worked in another state, so we may actually have an understatement of the total incidence of past employment. So that's encouraging. However, it turns out that for most individuals, that employment lies back over 2 years, once before entering receiving a service. Right? So these blue bars go down, well, because, only 30% have an employment spell in the year prior to becoming homeless, and only 20% are employed when they receive a service. Right? So there's a theme here that will sort of be recurring, is that yes, the majority of the homeless at some point had covered employment. The majority of those had that employment, quite a bit before entering the HMIS. But there is a sizable fraction of individuals that recently had a job. Right? Between 30 or 40% of people who receive services had a job in the 2 years prior to becoming homeless. Right? And so we will look at everyone, because that's the main group we're considering here, all people receiving services. But then we'll break out that group separately that had recent employment, and that's actually a sizable group. So I'm going to take clarification questions. Is that one? So that's the clarification. What do the last two bars mean? About 19% are employed on the time they receive services. And then there's some indication, and I'm going to come back to that in a third question, that once you receive services, employment rates tend to creep up somewhat. Right? So hold that. We're going to come back to that in a few slides. Let me move on. So the next big question is, well, there seems to be some employment capacity. Who are these individuals? And that's, of course, important for a place like LASA, because part of what they're trying to solve is, with limited resources, who should we support and push, immediately to try to regain employment, and for whom is that actually much harder to do. And we look at a range of demographic characteristics, and I'm going to show you really just the tip of the iceberg here. So one thing we found is that adults and families who receive service as families tend to have much higher employment rates while receiving services or before receiving services. So for adults and families, the typical adult, had worked, about a year ago, whereas for single adults who get services, had their last employment spell about 3 years ago. So that is borne out in other, signs of sort of acuteness. Right? Families tend to have a different homeless experience than adults, right? And are much more tied to the labor markets. The other thing we looked at is, so this is a slide deck from, nope. But it doesn't matter. I'm talking very slow anyway, and I have until 12:40, right? Okay. So I was just reading lately, good speakers don't need bullet points. So I'm going to talk you to some of the findings we have here. So we looked at other demographic outcomes, right? And a couple of demographic outcomes that stand out is age and race, right? And as some of you have gathered, a sample that is from age 18 to 70 is a very broad sample, especially for these poorer individuals. And it's been reasonably well understood that especially lower educated older individuals had, a decline in employment rates over time, over the last sort of 30 years. And so we probably wouldn't expect homeless individuals that are 50, 55, or 60 to have high employment rates because they already have difficulties being employed in the labor market. And that's clearly borne out in the data. So the employment rates of those in what we call prime working age, that's a definition from age 24 to 55. They have quite a bit higher employment rates in the years before entering receiving services. So these employment rates are more closer to between 30, 40, 50%. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when you think through who might be the ones that could use short-term support to regain employment. The other thing we found is that we could look at, given our sample size of 3 broad race groups, blacks, Latinx, and whites. And on average, whites have consistently the lowest employment rates. And that's borne also out in other statistics about the homeless. On average, the acuteness level of single adult white men typically is much higher, right? And I don't have time to talk about it, right? But here's a sobering statistic. In LA County, about 10% of the population is black, and about 40% of the homeless is black. So if you are a black person, the risk of becoming homeless, even though you might be employed and you might be healthy, is much higher, right, than for a white person. And so on average, the employment rates of blacks and Latinx are higher than for whites, who are much more acute and much sicker and so on by the time they become homeless. So another thing we did, whenever you start doing a descriptive analysis looking at a broad range of groups, you start getting concerned that really you might be not measuring different factors, but that these some of these characteristics are correlated. So for example, maybe the fact that white single men are not working is simply due to the fact that they have higher mental health issues, or the fact that older individuals are not working is simply due to the fact that they have higher rates of disability. And the way you typically address this, I'm talking here to the students on my right, right, is you run a linear regression model, right? And so you run a regression by which you take the employment rate and then you control for a range of characteristics. And then each characteristics in that model shows you the independent effect of that characteristics holding these other characteristics constant. So then you get the effect of age on employment, right, holding constant, say, the rate of disability. And that's very important to complement these sort of more descriptive analysis. The other thing why such a regression is important, because another thing, and I'm going to look into the right side here in the room, that regressions do is they can allow you to predict employment rates for individuals based on all their characteristics. Right? And so if you're working with a homeless service authority, right, and you have a lot of information on characteristics, right, you are able to see as a person comes in, right, given that characteristics, well, how much would we expect that person to work? Right? So you can use these regressions to help prioritize services in an environment where you have a lot of information on these individuals and are trying to figure out, well, on average, right, if you're, say, a middle-aged woman, Latinx, right, coming from the valley, the San Fernando Valley, how much would you typically work, right? If you work less than that, let's have a conversation of, whether there's something we can help you with, right? And that's why we ran this regression. And the results in this regression tie sort of neatly into our next topic, namely, the first thing we found is that we confirm that some of the descriptive factors we isolated are sort of independently important, meaning older individuals holding everything constant tend to work less. Families tend to work more than single adults, right? And the whites tend to work the least, holding constant, say, health and so on. But one thing that becomes incredibly predictive of working once you receive services is whether you had any recent employment history. To some degree, that doesn't come as a surprise. For those of you who think about labor markets, often individuals that haven't participated in the labor market for some time have a lot of difficulties re-entering the labor market and finding jobs, right? for many possible reasons, right? But certainly for the homeless, being detached from the labor market for a long time seems to be a particular barrier. And so those individuals that had employment in the last 2 years are very likely to find employment after service receipt, especially if that employment led to earnings that was above the federal poverty line. And what I'm going to do next, I'm going to talk a bit more. I think I'm going backwards. What are the employment dynamics around homelessness? And I have until 12:40. Yeah. So let's take stock for a moment. So what were our first two findings? We found that a large fraction of the homeless had employment at some point, though for many that lie in the past, right? And that there is a sizable group that had recent employment. And then we showed, right, who are the individuals that have the highest employment rates, right? And the highest employment rates after becoming services partly arises for those who were still attached to the labor market. And so we're going to take a closer look now at how employment evolves around the time individuals get services. And that is interesting for a few reasons. One reason is, of course, that we try to understand, right, to predict who might be employed in the future. But it's also important, as I said earlier, because we'd like to know whether a housing crisis might be closely related to an employment crisis, broadly speaking. And you'll see in a little bit why that matters. And so what we did, we looked at individuals relative to the time they received homeless services, and then looked for 2 years in the past, 8 quarters, and 2 years into the future. What's the rate of being employed in a given quarter? What's the fraction of individuals who 1 year before receiving services had an employee relationship, okay, of any amount? Okay? And then we plot you the percentage of clients that have earnings records before and after receiving services. And it is by nature of the data that the event around which we look at the employment history combines both individuals who just became homeless and went to get a service, as well as individuals who may have been homeless for a while and just end up, at some point getting services. And so it is not completely easy to tease these things apart, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that. So we combine both, the event here is both becoming homeless as well as getting a service. So we have 2 lines here. The one line is the full sample. And then we thought, well, if we look at everyone, we know that a large fraction of those hasn't been working for a long time. Right? So let's also look at a sample of workers that had recent employment attachment. Right? So we looked at a sample of workers that had some employment 3 to 4 years before becoming homeless, so that we can then look in the 2 years prior to homelessness. Right? And so about 30% of people had some employment 3 or 4 years before becoming homeless, and then we look at the dynamics. And I'll show, here's why that's important. So if you look at all the individuals receiving homelessness services, you see that employment doesn't change very much around the time they either become homeless or receive services. Yes, it maybe declines a little bit, right? And then maybe it comes up again a little bit. But the main impression is one of flatness, right? And interestingly enough, that's exactly what was found in New York City. In New York City, entering a homeless shelter, which in New York City is much more closely related to actually becoming homeless because they have a right to shelter, right, was not at all related to the rate of employment. And I have a colleague who's working at the U.S. Census Bureau on U.S.-wide data, and that's what he seems to find too. On average, entering a shelter or becoming homeless or receiving a service doesn't seem to be strongly correlated with the employment rate, which then may one lead to say, well, a homelessness crisis, right, is not related to an employment crisis. So stabilizing employment isn't perhaps what we should do next, right? We have to look elsewhere, right? And we found that that's only partly the right conclusion, because when we looked at people who actually have something to lose, meaning those who had some recent employment, right, there is very well a pretty big decline in employment as you're obtaining services, and that, relative to your employment rate a couple of years before becoming homeless, you experience a permanent decline in the employment rate, right? So partly, right, this absence of a relationship between employment and service received is driven due to the fact that a lot of people just haven't been working. And if you look at those who have been working, yes, right, an employment crisis does seem to be related to a housing crisis, and that's an important finding. What we then did, we again looked at various groups. For example, we looked at families versus single adults, and that's a bit of a more complex graph, but really the yellow lines are adults and families who were recently employed and who were not recently employed. And you can see for adults and families, if they were recently employed, over half of them were working initially. They experience a decline, right? There's some sort of employment crisis, but then they do bounce back. Not completely, but there's a recovery. Versus for single adults, that's the blue line that were recently employed, they really experience a permanent decline. And you can do that with other characteristics to think through who are the big losers, so to speak, and who may be actually gaining as they retain services. And we, I don't have time to do it today, but you can also look at, the different service types, right? You can look at people who enter permanent supportive housing, which is where individuals are sent who have, who are very acute, who cannot, be stabilized by giving them back to employment. So these are the mentally ill, drug users or people with physical disabilities, right? So individuals who receive permanent supportive housing experience very little employment, whereas individuals who receive temporary housing vouchers, do experience some employment decline and higher employment rates afterwards. And so this data set is really useful to zooming in and figuring out, right, who we could think of assisting if we had to, or if we had the funding and wanted to. So let me, as we're sort of heading towards the finish line, briefly talk about earnings. Earnings is interesting for two reasons. Obviously, we care about earnings because if individuals work and have extremely low earnings, right, then helping them regain employment is going to be useful for many reasons, but it won't be sufficient necessarily to really lead to stabilized housing. It's one question. The other question is, economists have used earnings as another measure of the intensity of employment. Here's why, right? When I talked about employment so far, I looked at whether somebody is working at all in a particular quarter or not. Okay? Now, you can easily imagine that employment might fluctuate even though an individual has employment in every quarter. Of course, if you may, be losing your house, right, you may be working less hours because you spend a lot of time shuttling around friends and families, or you may take off a few weeks from work, but you may still have positive employment in a quarter, right? And so as a labor economist, we talk about employment at the extensive margin, do you work or not, versus employment at the intensive margin. Given you're working, how much are you working? How many hours, how many days, and at what pay? And earnings then is a useful sort of catch-all measure because it will depend on how many days you worked, how many hours you worked, and what type of job you have. And so we look at earnings, both we care about the level of earnings, but we also care about, how the level of earnings varies around the date of homelessness. So here's a figure where we show for the full sample of people receiving assistance in Los Angeles County, as well as for the people who worked recently, meaning that had some employment a bit before 2 years before becoming homeless or receiving services. And then we just show you their total annual earnings. And what you can see, let's look at the full sample. Annual earnings is pretty low. So the federal poverty line for an individual is $12,000. Right? So the average earnings is, about below the federal poverty line for the full sample. So there are a lot of individuals with very low earnings. And what is interesting here is you see that earnings decline somewhat for the full sample before entering services, and then they bounce back somewhat. And so they have sort of a V shape, okay, also for the full sample. Even though we did not see any change in overall the rate of being employed or not, right, there seems to be a decline in hours or a decline in days worked and a bounce back. Now, I've made the case that it's actually important to also look at those who receive services and become homeless that had recent employment histories, for whom the chances of finding employment are actually much higher, right? And so the dark blue bar shows the total annual earnings for those. And you say, okay, they earn around $15,000 per year on average. That looks like good news relative to the federal poverty line of $12,000. On the other hand, we're talking about Los Angeles, right? The average median income in Los Angeles is $60,000, right? And the federal poverty line for a family is $24,000. So these individuals are very poor, right? And even though if you do have recent employment attachment, you do a little better, right? You're really at the margin of being able to sustain housing, right? In say an expensive housing market as Los Angeles. So I'm ready to wrap up, right? We use data on homelessness services and on administrative data on employment, and to look at the employment pattern of the homeless. And we had really four main takeaways, right? The people receiving homelessness service in LA had, a high rate, were employed at some point. For many, that's a long time ago. But there's a substantial fraction of individuals, right, that had recent employment, right, between 30 and 40%, were actually recently attached to the labor market. And then there are really systematic difference in employment rates among groups that have to be taken into account, right, in thinking through who to serve and how to serve individuals, right? And the data is really useful at pinpointing that. And then we found that while on average the employment rate doesn't seem to be really varying around service receipt, for those individuals who have something to lose, meaning that were actually working recently, we do see that there is a permanent decline in the incidence of having earnings, right? And then there's some good and bad news on earnings, or maybe mostly bad news. The earnings of individuals who do work are really extremely low, right? We do see some decline and bounce back of earnings around the date of service receipt, so that's sort of feel like maybe a silver lining. But even for those who have a high employment attachment, right, who have somewhat higher earnings, average earnings are quite low. I'm going to stop here and open the floor for questions.